Mexico '86. The World Cup that gave us the wave, Linekar's golden boot, Josimar's wondergoals, Pique the Jalapeno, and Maradona doing this before turning England's defence into a gaggle of confused statues. But if you were to take a closer look and peel back the logo on the 1986 Panini Sticker Album, you'll find that it could have been a very different story. Mexico '86 should have been Colombia '86. Colombia is the only nation in the history of the sport to be officially awarded the rights to host the World Cup, only to hand the keys back to FIFA and say, actually I can only drive automatic. But what made Colombia's World Cup dream disappear into the Amazon rainforest, only to emerge a decade later looking like, that thing? To understand that, we need to go back, way back, to meet the architect of Colombia's bid, Alfonso Señor Quevedo. Aside from having a hairline that doesn't quite make sense to me, Alfonso Señor is a key figure in the history of Colombian football. In 1946, he was elected president of Millonarios FC, and from the late 40s, masterminded the club's aggressive policy of signing stars from other South American countries, particularly Argentina, during the El Dorado era of Colombian football. Add that to the shortlist. Over the next 2 decades, his status within Colombian football would rise significantly, culminating in him serving as the president of Colombia's Football Federation between 1964 and 1971, and then again between 1975 and 1982. It would be during his first term in 1970 that Alfonso Señor had his big brainwave. With the World Cup having already taken place in Uruguay, Brazil, Chile, and due to take place in Argentina in 1978, why couldn't Colombia take centre stage as the next South American host on FIFA's Continental Roundumabob? And so, an opportunity presented itself for Brand Quevedo to go international. In 1970, Colombia's then president, Carlos Lleras Restrepo, supported Alfonso Señor in launching a bid for a Colombian World Cup in 1986. Colombia has a tremendous number of football fans and is currently developing widespread programs in all fields of sports organisation, buildings, stands, stadia playing fields, and recreation centres. Yeah, we'll come back to that. FIFA largely agreed with Alfonso Señor Quevedo, partly because of the Colombians' friendship with then FIFA President Sir Stanley Rouse, but mostly because they were the only country that could be bothered with bidding for the tournament in the first place. Apparently, a lot of countries just couldn't be arsed with hosting the World Cup, which I can understand. I mean, there was just so much to do with the creation of infrastructure, building of stadiums, designing of logos. It was a right ball ache. And while everyone agreed the World Cup was a fun thing, whoever hosted it usually got stuck with a big old bill. Why do you think nobody throws house parties anymore? They're expensive. Unless I'm just not getting invited anymore. Actually, that explains a few things. But Alfonso Señor was an ambitious one. He believed that the World Cup would be the great engine that would force Colombia to modernise, and Sir Stanley loved that romantic So, on the 9th of June 1974, with no one else throwing their hat into the ring, Colombia were officially announced as hosts for World Cup 1986. Good luck, Alfonso. See you in 12 years. However, Colombia's dream ticket of a Stanley Rouse and Alfonso Señor Quevedo World Cup would quickly get ripped up, consumed for dramatic effect, and passed as a Jules Gillet-shaped stool. I better get that scene too. Enter Zhao, I'm slightly less corrupt than the rest of them, Havelange. On 11th of June 1974, just a couple of days after Colombia were confirmed as hosts of the 1986 World Cup, the Brazilian had defeated Sir Stan to become the 7th FIFA president, and the new management was keen to stamp their authority and shake up the World Cup. Under Havelange, FIFA entered a new era of globalization and commercialism. Havelange and friends recognised that if football was to develop globally, FIFA needed to attract interest from sponsors. And what better way to attract brands to the game than to make their own crown jewel, the World Cup, bigger and better. In 1977, Havelange proposed expanding the World Cup from 16 teams to a 24-team tournament, and soon enough it was confirmed that from 1982 the World Cup would become a 24-team battle royale. This meant more matches, more fans, more officials, journalists, broadcasting personnel, professional goalpost movers, and people to dress up as the Colombia '86 mascot. What was that supposed to be again? Ugh, Jesus Christ. This was somewhat of a problem for Colombia, who had agreed to host a modest by comparison 16-team competition, and the planning they had promised for that World Cup hadn't really got going yet. Mascot aside, of course. Ugh. With successive governments failing to commit enough resources to the World Cup project, FIFA took one look of Colombia's preparations and went into panic mode. To give Alfonso Senor Quevedo and the Colombian authorities a kick up the arse, FIFA issued a set of requirements that needed to be met in order for them to host the World Cup. These included, amongst other things, 12 stadiums with a minimum capacity of 40,000, 4 of which needed to be able to fit at least 60,000 for the knockout stages, and 2 that were 80,000 capacity for the opening game and final. 15,000 additional hotel rooms, a robust and modern telecommunications network capable of beaming colour satellite feeds to every corner of the planet, vast improvements to roads, airports and rail networks, as well as allowing for the free circulation of international currency in the country, and a fleet of private limos for FIFA brass. To say these requirements were unrealistic for a country like Colombia would be somewhat of an understatement. For example, there were only 2 football venues with a capacity above 40,000 in the country at the time, and to this day there's only 4 stadiums in Colombia that could meet FIFA's minimum threshold. Then there's the transportation demands. FIFA insisted on a robust rail network which zigzagged across the country, connecting all of Colombia's host cities, in order for fans to get around more easily. This was problematic because A. Colombia's nationalised railway had been in the shitter for years due to lack of investment, and B. because of the f***ing Andes. For Colombia, this meant the World Cup party budget was getting a little out of hand. The government's initial projection in the early 70s estimated that hosting the World Cup would cost around 5 billion Colombian pesos. By the end of the decade, it had grown to nearly 3 times that figure, and by the time of FIFA's official requirements, costs had exploded to anywhere between 70 and 100 billion pesos, or around $2 billion US. Havelange and friends would have no doubt known this. Colombia had as much of a chance of meeting FIFA's requirements as my nan has for being named Max Verstappen's teammate next season, and she's blind. And dead. This left Colombia in a bit of a pickle. Under a new president, Julio Cesar Turbay Ayala, the government realised that funding this new juiced-up World Cup with taxpayers' money was a real no-go given the unrest at the time. But giving up on the World Cup completely would not only be somewhat embarrassing for the country, but also wouldn't go down well with the football-mad Colombian public. So they instead assembled a crack team of private investment Avengers to help save Colombia's World Cup dream. Corporación Colombia '86 included representatives from some of the country's largest business groups, including the Grupo Santo Domingo, owners of Bavaria, and the Grupo Gran Colombiano. However, the funding mission would last about 5 minutes, as the economic environment in Colombia went from shit to shit. Global coffee prices began to dip, Latin America was heading into recession, and just to cap things off, Colombia's banking sector went into meltdown. Suddenly, the private sector supergroup that was supposed to build 12 stadiums and an Andean railway was nowhere to be seen. And with the state treasury occupied with saving the banking system, the coffers for the World Cup were well and truly empty. As the curtain came down on the 1982 World Cup in Spain, the worldwide footballing community soon turned its attention to Colombia, and it didn't like what it was seeing. Suddenly, FIFA's doubts about Colombia's ability to host the tournament were becoming public knowledge, as reports swelled that the United States, Mexico, Canada, or even Brazil could step in. "We do not want to take the 1986 World Cup from Colombia, but if they cannot do it, we are prepared to hold it in the States," said, hang on a minute, Henry Kissinger, what are you doing here? With no shortage of other countries willing to take the reins of Colombia, FIFA gave the South American nation 120 days from the day after the World Cup final in Madrid to get their act together, or they were going to get binned. It would be one of the most terrible blows of my life if we now renounced the right to hold the World Cup. I've got some bad news for you, Alfonso, because on October 25th, 1982, in a television broadcast from Colombia's new president, Belisario Bentancur, the 1986 World Cup dream would be finally buried. I announced to my compatriots that the 1986 World Football Championship will not be held in Colombia. Here in this country, we have many things to do, and there is no time to attend to the extravagances of FIFA and its partners. Bentancur pulled the plug on Colombia's World Cup, stating that the country didn't need stadiums, it needed schools and hospitals. Which is fair enough, assuming they ever got built. Oh, they didn't. That's a shame. With Colombia out of the picture and less than 3 years to get ready, FIFA held an open, transparent bidding process to find a replacement. Of course they didn't. This is FIFA we're talking about. The USA immediately threw their name into the hat. With the North American Soccer League on life support, the United States saw the World Cup as just the treatment they needed to pull football in the USA back from the dead. They had the stadiums, the infrastructure, the money. They even had an all-star delegation dream team consisting of Pelé, Franz Beckenbauer, and Henry Kissinger. Again. Canada also put in a bid. Bless them. Keen to get some use out of the Olympic Stadium they'd built a decade earlier. But the third candidate, Mexico, had an ace up their proverbial sleeve that the other bidders couldn't beat. FIFA's Mexican Vice President, Guillermo Cañedo. Now, what's interesting about Mexico's bid was that it was primarily driven by Grupo Televisa, one of the biggest media groups in Mexico, under the ownership of Emilio Azcárraga Milmo. Emilio had close ties with FIFA's vice president, who of course was good pals with João Havelange. I wonder where this is going. A World Cup in Mexico would mean Televisa would hold the lucrative broadcasting rights, as well as subsidies to modernize their broadcasting infrastructure. FIFA would get a powerful media conglomerate on side, and Mr. Cañedo would get kudos for being the middleman. Everyone was a winner. Well, apart from the USA and Canada. Despite going through the rigmarole of trying to make it look like a fair and open process, it was always going to be Mexico. From day one, the FIFA Executive Committee neglected the USA and Canadian bids, claiming the distance teams would have to travel would be too great, as well as citing a lack of footballing culture and the wide use of AstroTurf would make the countries unsuitable hosts for the World Cup. FIFA inspectors didn't even bother travelling to Canada or the United States to meet with delegates. On the 20th of May 1983, the 3 countries bidding for the World Cup gave their final pitches to the FIFA Executive Committee. Canada presented for 30 minutes and submitted a 90-page technical document outlining why they should get the gig. The United States delegation, led by Henry Kissinger, Pelé and Beckenbauer, talked for nearly an hour. Mexico were done with their pitch within 8 minutes. When asked why they didn't go on any longer, the president of Mexico's Football Federation said, "We only needed 1 minute to convince them." And convince them they did, apparently. All 21 committee members unanimously voted for the 1986 World Cup to be relocated to Mexico. Many of us who worked on the project for the United States to host the World Cup were confident that we were going to win, Pelé would later say. Havelange always denied that he had been pressured by the powerful Mexican media group, but we were all shocked that the US proposal wasn't even considered. While Henry Kissinger would later go on to say, "The politics of soccer make me nostalgic for the politics of the Middle East." Less than 2 years later, the NASL would be toast, and the United States would have to wait until 1994 to host their first World Cup. Yes, I'm going to show the Diana Ross clip again.
Calamity.
Against the backdrop of social unrest, its own economic crisis, and the devastating Mexico City earthquake of 1985, which caused the deaths of thousands and left tens of thousands homeless, Mexico continued as host of the 1986 World Cup regardless. But that is a story for another day. Colombia, on the other hand, who would have automatically qualified for World Cup 1986 as hosts had they gone ahead with it, were knocked out by Paraguay during the qualification process and would have to wait until 1990 to make a World Cup appearance, their first since 1962. When Colombia were announced as hosts in 1974, the country rejoiced. By 1982, the crippling reality set in that a supersized World Cup 86 in Colombia was about as good of an idea as a WrestleMania held in a casino parking lot. If I'm being honest, a downsized 16-team tournament would have been a huge ask for the country. Even if we ignore the collapsed banks, FIFA stadium demands, and a magical railway, by the time the tournament was supposed to kick off, Colombia was grappling with drug cartels, guerrilla groups, and its own natural disaster in the shape of the Armero tragedy in November 1985. On one hand, you could argue that a World Cup in 1986 could have been a shining light for the country during an otherwise dark period. On the other, it could have crippled the country entirely. Alfonso Senor, the man who spent the better part of a decade chasing this dream, chose not to stick around. He resigned shortly after the president's announcement by saying, "Colombia is a dwarf country that doesn't like big things. I wanted something of that size for Colombia, and Colombia failed me." While Alfonso Senor viewed it as a national failure, in hindsight, walking away from the 1986 World Cup might have been the only thing Colombia got right. Going out on their own terms saved Colombia from the humiliation of FIFA stepping in publicly. Or, even worse, the potential legacy of hosting an undercooked World Cup with a dozen half-finished stadiums and a mascot drawn on the back of a cigarette packet. Ugh.